afternoon. It is a real pleasure to see everybody here. I would like to start off by thanking the University of Westminster, not just for giving us a room, but for hosting us as an institution and as a community of scholarship. Very happy that Hirsh is here, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and I would like to call upon Sylvie Bacquet to speak on behalf of the university.
Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Westminster. As the Assistant Head of the Law School, it is my absolute pleasure and honour to be able to host the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and to welcome you all in our law school. Really excited to hear from some of the contributors of the 3 volumes which are launching today in response to the Hamas attack in Israel on the 7th of October. This is a really important event taking place at a challenging time for the Jewish community, especially within higher education, and I'm delighted that the Westminster Law School takes pride in hosting those events and provides a safe space for all voices to be heard. On a more personal level, I feel privileged to facilitate events like this one and the one we hosted back in February, when we had the honour to welcome Deborah Lipstadt in this very same lecture theatre where I work on a daily basis. Certainly felt very special and moving to hear from all the contributors in the current context of insecurity that we feel as a Jewish community. The resurgence of anti-Semitism that we're witnessing since the 7th of October is a topic that is very close to home, both personally and professionally. As a member of the Jewish community with deep connections to Israel, I couldn't help but feeling a sense of intellectual isolation over the past few months. Having dedicated most of my academic career so far to understanding religious freedom and manifestation of belief, as well as advocating for equality and acceptance between all faith and none, I find myself fighting my own inner struggles in the face of painful silence. It is both refreshing and comforting to step away from the frenzy of social media and to make space for a more thought-through approach to the issues facing the Jewish community today. This is what this evening is about, and I cannot wait to hear from the contributors and later on to get my own copy of the books and start reading. I just want to end by thanking our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Hirsh, whose work on EDI is well known. Thank you, Hirsh, for not giving in to the pressure of those who want to quieten our voices. Many thanks also to Debs Harris, one of our college administrators, for looking after the organisation of the event. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. So I was asked to be an examiner on a viva a few months ago, back in November, and as we are getting used to nowadays, the viva was on Zoom, it was remote, and the candidate said, I might have to stop for a minute during the viva because my husband is here for a day because he has to go to a couple of funerals in Tel Aviv, and then he's going back to the front in the north. So I'm happy to get on with the viva, but I might have to interrupt it for a moment. And that's what happened. Suddenly this guy looking around for his kit, and she says, I just need to stop for a moment. And we see the examiners, myself at Goldsmiths and the other examiner at King's, and the supervisor watch her saying goodbye to her husband to go to the northern, well, what might have become the northern front. And we said, should we have 15 minutes break? And she said, yeah, please. So we had a break, and then we carried on with the viva. Extraordinary event, really. And if I'm really honest, I'm not sure that I was exactly the right person in disciplinary terms to do that viva. I think I was fine. But I think really I was asked to do that viva partly because they were having trouble finding somebody who they knew would be fair to somebody in Tel Aviv at that moment. And I think that's an extraordinary possibility. So let me tell you a couple of things just about the London Centre quickly. I won't talk much because we have lots and lots of interesting people. We are formalising and organising the networks of scholars who are studying anti-Semitism and who are engaged in areas of academia where anti-Semitism is a live issue, which, to be honest, is really similar because those people also have to understand the anti-Semitism that they are finding around themselves. We feel that we are quite often excluded from the ordinary community of scholarship that is the university, and we absolutely, far from wanting to leave it and go and create our own, we don't want to leave it, we want to engage with it further, but we also feel the need to create our own community of scholarship and our own infrastructure of scholarship. And infrastructure means things like publishing books, things like the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, things like the conferences that we are part of organising, the international comradeship and networks of scholars that we are part of. We will very soon be issuing a call for papers for a major conference in 2025 in April. I'm hoping, in fact, I think we have agreement that it will be centred in this room. So again, really a very warm collaboration with the University of Westminster. People might remember we had a conference in 2022, and I think this one will be bigger. We are bigger and more professional and better organised. We are working with people at the Compass Centre at Haifa University, who are also much more organised than they were. We are also aware that a lot more people are thinking seriously about anti-Semitism in our time, especially across America. And there are groups and networks of people studying anti-Semitism in a serious way, springing up across America and other places. So we fully expect that conference to be really big and exciting, and it will be April 2025. So communities of scholarship and infrastructure of scholarship, and really to put our feet down and to say we are academics and we will remain in the academic community. We will do academic work. We will not be driven out of the universities or out of our disciplines, out of sociology or law or any of the other disciplines. And we will insist that we have every right to be there and that we have something to give. I honestly believe that my work is funny because I am quite often tempted to just give up on sociology and to say, I'm really so sick of what most sociologists are doing. But then I find myself writing and I find myself being actually quite loyal to sociology and using a sociological method and developing a sociological account and understanding of anti-Semitism. And it surprises me in a way, and it kind of delights me in a way, because it proves to myself anyway that we are not outside and we are not going anywhere, but we are firmly within the disciplines and the institutions where we ought to be. This book is really driven, the energy for this book came mainly from Rosa Freedman, who I'm going to ask to speak in a moment. And it was a kind of crazy energy. It was, we put out a public call for papers, a call for contributions about October the 7th. I think that many people around us, both in academia and in public life more generally, and perhaps in life more generally, and perhaps in the media too, so many people seem to fail to stop and look and think, even on the 7th of October. They didn't stop and really see what was happening. So many people just slotted the events into their pre-existing frameworks of understanding which were and are inadequate. And the only way that they found themselves able to do that was really to bypass the 7th of October altogether. People trivialized it. They said, well, it's just normal, it's nothing special, and it's trivial compared to the real violence, which is X, Y, and Z, whatever they think it is. They trivialized it, they denied it. They said, no, there was no sexual violence, there was no murder, there was just a rebellion of the colonized people. They victim blamed. People said Israel invited Hamas in because it wanted a pretext to commit genocide. And, oh gosh, there's a fourth thing on my list, which will come back to me. But there were all sorts of strategies for really not stopping and looking and thinking. And that's unforgivable, I think, especially for academics who have a duty not just to be caught up in the moment, but they have a duty to stop and look and think first, and then to work on understanding. So we put out a call for contributions, and we got lots. And we had this format, which was like a short book that Routledge does. We have a brilliant partnership with Routledge that we're very proud of, also run by Rosa, and they said 50,000 words and we can get it out in 3 months. And we went back to them and we said, we've got a few more than 50,000 words, and they said, no, that's a hard limit. They said, but you can do 2. We said, all right, we'll do 2. As you know, we have 3. And it's an extraordinary achievement. And I will ask Rosa to come and speak, because otherwise I'll be telling all her stories, possibly. Rosa.
Thank you very much, Divyesh, for hosting us once again, and to Sylvie for hosting us and for organising this event. I think for people outside of academia, don't always realise how difficult it is not to put the event on, but to jump through the hoops needed to make sure that all voices are heard in the universities, that they're heard respectfully, but that academic freedom, which is our freedom to produce knowledge based on our expertise, is upheld, and the University of Westminster is fantastic at it. I think after the initial shock, although I think I'm still living in the initial shock of 7th of October, I, like many people, felt incredibly impotent, particularly people in the diaspora, about what could we do? We could see our friends and our families in Israel suffering. We could see Jews around the world suffering. And we could also see what was going to be coming, which, let's acknowledge, is today a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. We knew that there was going to be a huge rise of victim blaming, and we didn't know what to do. And I'm very fortunate that I have platforms. I have platforms with governments and with the UN. I have platforms on the media. But I wanted to use a different platform. I wanted to use this book series to try and document and gather exactly what David said, responses to 7th of October from across different disciplines and different perspectives. Not something that would take a year and a half to come out and would be beautifully polished pieces. Not academic articles and chapters to be cited and taught from, but actual raw and urgent responses from experts in their field about what was going on. So we gave everyone 4 weeks to send pieces in, and I said to them all, make sure that you're pitching your piece to my mother. My mother, who is engaged and wants to know, but is not disciplinary trained in sociology or law. I didn't want jargon. I wanted books that people could access. And David said I was mad, and everyone else said I was mad, but my whole life I've been told I'm mad, so that's fine. And we had so many contributions that we have 3 volumes, and we had to leave out contributions that would otherwise have been published. And we opened up networks to people that, some of whom I'm meeting for the first time in person tonight, people who just came pouring in, either from existing networks of the centre, people from LinkedIn, people from all over the place. What we found was Jewish and non-Jewish academics who hadn't necessarily talked about anti-Semitism or talked about Israel, but it formed part of their work, were suddenly willing and wanting to contribute. Now, I was very privileged to do an online event with John Strawson. When was it, Mum? Last week. And John wrote the most powerful, reflective piece for this collection. And he talked at that event about how he wasn't able to write until we put out these calls for papers. I actually wasn't able to write at all for this, apart from a very short introduction. I still feel that my voice hasn't yet come out, but what I do know from the contributors is it gave people an avenue to do what we do best as academics and write and research and provide an evidence base for what was going on in the world around us. And it ranges from trauma specialists in psychology to sociologists to lawyers, political scientists, and many more. It's probably, apart from my child, the thing I'm the most proud of that I've done. And it is raw. It's not beautifully polished. There are pieces in there that, you know, maybe have some spelling and grammar mistakes, or maybe were a bit clumsily written in that aftermath. But actually taking that clumsiness away and polishing it up takes away from the documentary evidence of what we were all going through individually and collectively. We are immensely privileged tonight to have 3 of our contributors here, 2 of whom have flown in from abroad. And it wasn't a pleasure to work on this book at all, and it was deeply distressing at times, and yet it was an incredibly powerful experience. And I say that as someone who hates editing other people's work. We were so fortunate to have contributors who were committed to the project, who were responsive, who didn't take it personally when I put red pen through the way they'd phrase things, particularly people not writing in their first language, who I think were incredibly kind to me, putting red pen through things. We had contributors who really cared, and one of the reasons that we wanted to have people coming in from abroad is we had international collaborators who made us feel less alone here in the UK. So thank you to the University of Westminster. That's the end of my bit, and now I can enjoy the rest.
Thank you so much. One of the things that was extraordinary and is extraordinary about the work that we do, for example, the conference that we had 2 years ago and the one that we will have next year, is that for some people, there were people at our conference last time who were kind of euphoric being in that space. And I think some of them hadn't quite realized the toxicity of the environment that they were working in day to day until for a couple of days they found themselves in not a hostile environment, not an environment where anti-Semitism was normal, not an environment where they had to defend their very right to speak straightforwardly and thoughtfully. And I think I remember inviting Torkel Brekke, for example, our next speaker, to become a fellow of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And I was shy. I'm always shy when I ask people, you know, would you like to join us as a fellow? Because I feel it's a bit of an imposition. Do you want to put your name on our website? Do you want to be associated with us? It might cause you trouble. It might cause you the kind of trouble that we've already experienced. And actually, almost everybody just says, no, I'd really like to. And I think Torkel said to me also that he was feeling especially kind of isolated in Norway. Torkel had just produced a book on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on the left, looking at how it plays out in Norway. And I think he was feeling a little isolated, and I think he was very happy to find this wider community. And Torkel wrote a really fantastic piece for this book about the way that the discourse of October the 7th played out in Norway. And we have a few pieces about national particularities of how that worked. And in general, anti-Semitism is a kind of global phenomenon, more and more a global phenomenon, with, you know, communications being global, everything being global, but nevertheless it plays itself out differently in different places. So in South Africa, for example, it is a lot to do with processing the politics of apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. In Germany, it's a lot about the Holocaust. In Britain, it's a lot about colonial guilt. In France, it's halfway between the two, with both the legacy of Algeria and of Vichy. In the United States, it's very much about racism and the history of race. And so it's really important for us that part of this book was to have different national stories. So I'm very proud to invite Torkel to come and speak. Torkel, you're so welcome. And take a little time, because we have all spoken quite succinctly and we want to hear from you. Thank you.
That's so kind. Thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. And I mean, just to pick up on what you said, to me it's been so important to be part of the network that you and Rosa and others have created at the center. Super important, and I think it's a great honor to be invited to be part of it and to be here today. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Yes, this is the right. Yeah, thank you. So you asked us to talk around 7 minutes, and I'm going to try to take a snapshot. David just mentioned that I published a book in Norwegian last year, in the spring of 23, before the 7th October massacre, about anti-Semitism on the left. And then the 7th October happened, and I'm now writing a new book, which will hopefully be published by the center, and it's soon finished, so it should be out early 25, I hope. So I'm going to take a few snapshots from that book, and I'm starting with a slide here with 3 photos. On the top left hand, you can see an email, and that's really the starting point for my chapter for the book series that Rosa and David has edited. That's an email coming from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the 9th of October to the Chief of Staff at the Royal Castle in Oslo. And the mail says, look, it's really important that the king does not extend his own condolences to Israel for the massacre that just happened. And that created not a lot of fuss, but a little bit of discussions. There were a couple of MPs, Norwegian MPs, who came out in the newspapers and said that they found it strange that the MFA denied the king to send his condolences to Israel after this trauma. I've talked to people in the MFA, I know many people there, and they try to make the impression that this was really not a big deal, and so on and so on. The fact is that the king has extended condolences to similar terrorist attacks happening in other countries, like Pakistan, for instance. And so that's one of the starting points. On the right-hand side, you see the center of Oslo. This is the offices of the Labour Party. You can see Arbeiderpartiet on the building. They own that building, and this is early November. And I wanted to show you this picture because to me it illustrates a very interesting fact, namely that after the 7th of October happened, there is actually no municipality, no city, no place in Norway flew the Israeli flag. And I found that so interesting because if you looked in the news from Germany, from Austria, from Australia, from everywhere, you had cities, villages, what have you. You had the Israeli flag flying in sympathy. It didn't happen in one place in Norway. On the contrary, what happened was that the Palestinian flag came up really quite immediately after the attacks. So that's really interesting. On the bottom left is a slightly more recent photo. This is from the Women's Day this year in March, where you had a group of Jewish women, some of Israeli background, some Norwegian Jews, who wanted to, or actually had planned to take part in the Women's Day parade with paroles, with banners saying about the sexual torture, etc., that took place on 7th October. And that was an event that also made it to the papers because they were, so what you see here is a chain of people, chain of men actually, barring these Israeli and Jewish women from taking part in the parade and keeping them out. And the police told them there and then that, look, sorry, you have to go home because we can't guarantee your security. So these three pictures, they just illustrate something really interesting to me, the fact that after the 7th October massacre, there was no way that anybody, apart from a few really marginal organizations, nobody in civil society, in the political system, were able to show any sympathy or solidarity with Israel, in my opinion. And that's really, really interesting. So that's the sort of the starting point. Why is this? That's my puzzle. That's a puzzle that my book tries to answer. And to answer that question, I go back in history. I start really on the two pictures on the left are the logos of, on the bottom, AKP, which is the Communist Party, the Workers' Communist Party of Norway, and above that is the Palestine Committee of Norway. They were both, the AKP was founded in 1973, the Palestine Committee was founded in 1970. And I think it's really important that people understand that these organizations, actually you can make the same point for other European countries. The Palestine movement came out of what you can safely call extreme left movements in Europe. When I say extreme, I mean revolutionary Marxist movements. And the AKP is a Marxist-Leninist party. So what I do in the book, I look at many of the people, the biographies of individuals who were in both organizations and who created the Palestine movement in Norway. And the key argument in my book, just to make it really quick here, the key argument in my book is that we can observe, if you look at archives, newspapers, etc., we can observe what I call a mainstreaming of anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism in a Norwegian political culture from the extreme left into the mainstream from the 1970s going up till today. And the logo on the bottom right there is of what's called the Confederation of Trade Unions in Norway, and that is an extremely important part of my story because that's where much of the mainstreaming has taken place. These sort of fringe extreme organizations have very explicitly and consciously tried to influence the Confederation of Trade Unions, which sort of organizes over 30 different trade unions in Norway, and successfully has sort of turned most of these organizations in a strongly anti-Zionist direction. Let's see. So I should keep my time and go to my last slide. So first slide, the puzzle. Why is Norway such an anti-Israel and anti-Zionist country, which it is? Second slide, you have to go back in history, all that. There's a book coming out about the story. Third slide, what are the consequences today? Well, on the right side, on the right-hand side here, you see a recent survey made by the Holocaust Center in Oslo, showing that there is a sharp rise in anti-Semitism after the 7th of October in Norway. On the top here is a quote from somebody I know, a Jewish family moving to Israel because they don't feel safe anymore. And the last thing I want to say, bottom left here, is the heading of a op-ed by 2 Muslim leaders, and they exemplify something that I think is really important, namely that there has taken place a almost complete breakdown in inter-religious communication and trust. And this particular op-ed did exactly what David said. I call it a new kind of denialism, that things didn't really happen the way we think it did, there wasn't really a big massacre, etc., etc. So I want to stop there. Thank you very much.
Torkel, thank you so much. I thought there was a walkout going on in the middle of that, but it was just people wanted to see the slide. I was worried for a minute.
What did the last headline mean? What did that headline mean?
To be clear,
Can Torkel tell us what that
Yes.
last headline meant?
Yes, I can
For those
translate the last The headline says, the dehumanization makes possible the genocide of Palestine.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, what happened on the 7th of October was the most significant day of violence against Jews since the end of the Shoah. And the result of that was a huge increase in anti-Semitism across the world. Just that fact is something that requires a serious response. When I was in part of the campaign against the boycott of Israeli colleagues in Britain, well, I still am part of that campaign, but we were fighting that campaign back in 2005. And at one point there was an iteration of the boycott which said that we will boycott anyone with a connection to an Israeli university unless they will disavow in whatever words are required Israeli apartheid. And somebody got in touch with me, really quite upset. He was an academic in Britain, member of the UCU. And he said, I can't believe this purity test that is being proposed by the union because it reminds me so clearly of what happened to my father in a Polish university in 1968. And being a very ignorant early career academic, that was the first time I'd ever heard of the anti-Zionist campaign in Poland of 1968. We knew, of course, about Soviet anti-Zionism, but what I didn't know at that time was the anatomy of the government campaign in Poland. Only 23 years after the end of the Holocaust in Poland and in East Germany, of anti-Semitism. And it was interesting in relation to contemporary anti-Semitism because it seemed to be an anti-Zionism that was motivated by anti-Semitism. Anna might say more about that, she might not, but it seemed to come from a different direction. The anti-Semitism we see seems to be an anti-Zionism that is motivated from elsewhere, which becomes, in one way or another, anti-Semitic. But the Polish case, and certainly the Soviet case, seemed to be the opposite. It seemed to be an ancient left anti-Semitism, which found an expression in the rhetoric of hostility to Israel. And that is so interesting, I think, for us today, precisely because most of the people who embrace the kind of anti-Zionism which is anti-Semitic, they don't know the history of that anti-Zionism, they don't know the history of these ideas, and they think that they have invented it themselves in the last couple of years. And they are shocked when somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism. And for that reason and many others, it seems to me so important for people, especially the left, to understand its history. And one of the great joys of being involved with the Centre and this book too, as Rosa said, is to come across people in other places who we didn't know who are doing such important work. And there are 3 academics in Poland who are leading a really interesting and important funded project, Marcin Stanowski in Wrocław and Piotr how would I say his name? Foreski in Poznan, and Anna Zawadzka in Warsaw. And it's such an impressive project, and they are such brilliant, brave, but also disciplinary, clear and really mainstream academics, but they're studying things which are really difficult to study. So I would like to introduce Anna Zawadzka, who wrote... Anna's piece in this book is terrific. It says, actually, our experience in Poland is not the standard experience that we hear about from America or from Britain or from the big Jewish communities. Gosh, I could say more, but I won't say more because I'll let Anna say it. Thank you. Anna Zawadzka.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me today. I also must say that I'm really grateful to Rosa and David for pushing forward this whole project of this book and London Centre as well, because it's I felt how important it is for me exactly after 7th October. And as David, you said that after 7th October, people didn't stop and didn't think, but they just, they were going forward with all this. And I needed to stop and think. I really needed to stop and think, but the problem was that the world was speeding up and the events were so intense and so astonishing, but also so fast. And I have this feeling that we are now watching, observing, witnessing the very important moment of the history of anti-Semitism, of the current history of anti-Semitism, and we need to capture it while it is happening. And this is super difficult because usually, as a sociologist, I work with a history. For example, in this project of 1968, we are working on historical materials. We use some historical sources. But what is it, and then you can, from the perspective, you can see some dynamics. And when you say, David, that now we know about anti-Semitism in 1968 in Poland, that it was actually the anti-Semitic campaign or hidden under the anti-Zionist banner, we know it now. But I think when it was happening, it was not so clear, even for Jews who were victims of this campaign. And it was very difficult to analyze and to recognize what is what while it was happening, because it was so intense and it was so brutal. And this is exactly what I feel now, that maybe, when we think about what is happening now in 20 years, we will see also much more clearly what was the motivations and what was the strong drives of this whole anti-Zionist discourse. So I prepared some things to say on the paper because I'm very chaotic when I speak English spontaneously. And I think I would like to start with some methodological question, which is very problematic for me as I work on anti-Semitism in Poland, because what I try to capture in Poland, if it comes to the current anti-Semitism, is how anti-Semitism is present in the very mainstream of Polish culture. I don't work on extremism or political extremism or so on. The very mainstream, the most legitimized culture of Poland is interesting for me because of some anti-Semitic tropes which are there. And I think my methodological question brought me to the point that I proposed in my recent book about Jewish Bolshevism, pattern of perception, that we should focus on what is anti-Semitic instead of asking question who is anti-Semite. And I think this reframing was very successful in introducing this category of systemic racism into the social sciences, and I think now more than ever we need an equivalent move toward anti-Semitism. We need to recognize anti-Semitism as a social dynamic. And this allows us to answer the question or answer this claim that I hear so often, but I'm not an anti-Semite. If someone says, but I'm not an anti-Semite, do their words or actions not have anti-Semitic power? Kathleen Hayes, who wrote this amazing text to anti-Zionists from a veteran left, wrote, and now I quote, "But you will say and believe you don't hate Jews. You've examined your heart and it doesn't contain the slightest trace of Jew hatred. I believe you, most of you anyway, when you say you don't harbor conscious antipathy to Jews. But that's really not the point. Anti-Semitism is stitched into the fabric of our society in ways that often go undetected, at least by the person in the grip of it. Anti-Semitism does not only come from anti-Semites." And I think this brings us to some tools to capture the phenomenon of anti-Semitism as an objective power, as David wrote in his book. And the thing is that when I was trying to figure out what can I propose, from the perspective of Eastern Europe, what kind of tools to trace it, I realized that actually all those tools have been already developed, and they are really great. Researchers of anti-Zionist discourse really deconstructed this discourse before it exploded in 7 October. So we have distortion of the Holocaust, the fantasies of the hegemonic power of the Jews, and the peculiar cruelty, this new version of a blood libel, the Livingston formulation, David's term, the legitimization and the demonization of Israel, and so on. We have all those constructs deconstructed by the scholars, and it's done perfectly. So what I can add from the perspective of an Eastern European country and a semi-peripheral country is that it's very problematic to perceive Israel as a colonial country when you remember that people who create Israel fled from Europe, especially from Poland, because of anti-Semitism. Danny Trom said that after 7 October, Israelis experienced the condition of a diaspora because they became Jews again, in a sense that they became again people whose security is not assured. And now, please imagine Palestine from the river to the sea, that is a world without Israel. What would it mean to the Jews, not from New York, but from Poland, for example, or from other Eastern European countries, or from post-Soviet republics? I think it's very colonial to limit the image of a diaspora to American Jews. There were Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, as well in Russia and the Asian republics of the Soviet Union, and some of them who survived the Holocaust did not leave precisely because they identified themselves as anti-Zionists. And initially, there were about 160,000 Jews left in Poland after the Holocaust, but 25 years later, there were only a few thousand. Students at Columbia University, as you probably know, shouted recently, "Jews, go back to Poland." If they knew what Poland was to the Jews in the 1920s and 1930s, they would know how brutally anti-Semitic it is to shout it. Colonialism and imperialism, how does this relate to the history of Eastern Europe? As Ari Shavit put it, now I quote, "We were not sent by white Europe, we ran away from white Europe," end of quote. If it comes to whiteness, you need to remember that during the Holocaust in Poland, it was most difficult to survive on the so-called Aryan side, Jews who escaped the ghettos were often returned to them, not because of Germans, but because of Poles, because it was much easier to survive in ghetto than outside. Until recently, you could buy in every kiosk this pamphlet, How to Recognize a Jew, by their physical features. So you could find an instruction how to recognize a Jew by their hair or nose or ears or mouth or the darkness of their skin or the shape of their eyes. And the hidden stigma is different than the open stigma, that's true, but it generates other forms of violence, especially act of unmasking. But the question is it the condition of whiteness? And now I would like to quote something, and I will tell you what is it at the end. Okay, I'm quoting. By justifying the aggressive policy of Israel's ruling circles and its servitude to imperialism, Zionist propaganda tries to make world public opinion believe that Israel is fighting for its existence. In turn, a slanderous charge of anti-Semitism is leveled at those who criticize Israel's Zionist aggressive policies. The Zionists agitate whoever they can to settle in Israel and oblige the rest of the Jewish community scattered all over the world to provide Israel with extensive aid. The aid demanded by the Zionist progenitors is aid to Israeli expansionism, which is backed by the forces of imperialism. And it sounds like a lot of statements that intellectuals and activists are signing today, but in fact it is a fragment of a Polish press article from March 1968. Anti-Zionism has a special history in Eastern Europe, as David mentioned, and immediately after the Six-Day War in 1967, under the banner of anti-Zionism, this anti-Semitic campaign was unleashed in Poland, and it culminated in the expulsion of some 15,000 Jews from the country. At that time, pretty spectacular anti-Zionism took place at Polish universities. If it comes to universities, it was a strange refrain of a history because in the 1930s, just before the war, the rectors of Polish universities introduced a numerus clausus. At the demand of the fascist groups, they limited the number of Jews to the 10% of all students. They also introduced a bench ghetto. Jews were only allowed to sit in especially marked areas, and their ID cards were stamped as Jewish. In 1968, the very same universities expelled Jews, usually communist and anti-Zionist, for Zionism. Jewish professors were sacked, Jewish students were struck off the students' register, and Jewish young people were rejected at the recruitment process. They were given a one-way ticket to travel abroad with the demand that they renounce their Polish citizenship. And literally a few days ago, something that I expected happened also at the university when I was a student. So the students from the same universities of 1930s and 1968 started to protest at the same campuses, and they demand that the rectors publicly condemn Israel, break off cooperation with all Israeli institutions, and that the truth be revealed around current cooperation with Israel, as if it were some kind of a dark secret behind it, a conspiracy that demands investigation. And these student protests, they call themselves, quote, part of a worldwide student intifada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want to introduce Eric Heinze next. I saw Eric giving evidence in the trial of Ronnie Fraser, and he was extremely articulate and coherent, and he gave very good evidence. And I have a very clear memory, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I think the cross-examination in that particular moment was just so unpleasant. It was so kind of sneering and piss-taking about Eric, who is a fantastic professor of law and specialist in social theory, and the barrister employed by our union to cross-examine was just kind of sneering about his intellectualism in a very unpleasant way. Eric is absolutely an intellectual, He's published recently a book on freedom of speech, a very engaged and coherent book. It's a book that people think they know everything. Yeah, not a book, a subject that everybody talks about, everybody thinks they know, but is actually deserves quite a lot of working through. Eric is doing some work, I think, for the intracommunal professorial group on the topic of academic freedom, and actually other people involved in this book, the anthology, are also central to that initiative. Odelia was also a editor of the book with me and Rosa also is a central actor in that initiative. So I will hand the floor to the brilliant Eric Heinze with all respect for your scholarly brilliance.
Well, I mean, thank you very much, David, Rosa, Westminster. It is really lovely to be here, and I'm sure I share everybody's joy in the appearance of these 3 volumes. It's lovely to see them appear. And certainly in the spirit of fairness, I would like to give all of you the opportunity as well to sneer at my intellectualism. And talking about courtrooms, let's chat for a minute about justice. It's something I tend to rant about to my students quite a bit. You know, very interestingly, for centuries, if disputes were being waged, and certainly at a high level about justice, it was about things like who has the valid claim to the throne, or what should the powers of the church be, or what should be the division of powers between a monarch and the aristocracy, and so forth. When you are all around the kitchen table, having some argument about justice, or sitting in the pub having that kind of argument, I doubt that you're arguing about any of those things. So what are you arguing about when you're arguing today about justice? I think it may be about things like colonial pasts, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And we tend to think that this shift in what we mean when we're talking about justice and the kind of things we're talking about, I think tend to be presented as, well, we're talking about the things that used to be marginalized or forgotten or sidelined. But I think it's much more than that. I think sometime around or after World War II, the very concept of history completely changed, i.e. of what it means to do history, to teach history, to transmit history, and to talk about it and argue about it around the kitchen table. It's not just bringing in topics that have been forgotten. It's not just shifting the deck chairs a little bit. I think what's happened is that today, the very idea of history in the West means that all of us collectively as a society are duty-bound to self-scrutinize. We have to fundamentally examine our history, our past, our culture as having engaged in centuries of injustice, of violence, of brutality. That fundamentally now defines what we mean by history, and certainly in the wider public. I don't want to talk for academic historians. And I think this is very good. I think this is historically unprecedented, right? There are many traditions going back hundreds and thousands of years throughout the world where it was seen as important for, kings or rulers, to think about errors they had made and try to correct them. But this is not what I'm talking about. The idea that a whole society has to fundamentally define its past in terms of its injustices, its brutalities, its exclusions, its repressions, I think is historically unprecedented and in a sense never existed in any mass way, certainly not before World War II. And I think this is, as I say, this is good. We should be proud of this. This is an achievement, and this is a gift of the left, of people and of progressives, of people like Hannah Arendt and Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, and it's a long list. But this brings up some interesting questions. We could call this a leftist view of history, right? The idea that history has to be fundamentally understood as collective self-scrutiny. And as I think Torkel rightly pointed out, this is no longer just of the left. It was initiated on the left through the kind of thinkers I've named, now going back 100 years and even more. But as Torkel rightly pointed out, this is actually what defines the mainstream understandings and concepts and language and discourse of justice, right? So again, sitting around your family dinner table or around the pub, right? You might have people taking very different positions on these issues, but they're taking positions on these issues. So the left might not have always won on these issues, or at least people on the left might think they have not always won, but something much deeper has happened is they've defined how we talk about justice, what we understand justice to require, to entail. And they've defined the kind of debates we have. Now, this is very important, right? And again, I have some interesting things with links with Torkel's presentation, right? On the left, as we've been seeing in our encampments, it's quite common, right, to insist, well, we're speaking for the voiceless, the underdog, the powerless, right? Which presupposes, right, a very all or nothing view of power and how it is, and what it is and how it works. But I think what's very interesting here is if we take a somewhat subtler view of power, and my God, all of these people are constantly telling us to read Foucault. Have they read it? Where all of power is apparently Foucault does not talk about bombs dropping or guns shooting. He talks about language, discourse, the terms in which a society talks about itself, again, regardless of the particular positions that are being taken. That is enormous power to define the debate. To define it such a, when you're around your kitchen table having these discussions, you're not asking each other, why do we think about justice in this way? It's just assumed that these are the arguments about justice that we need to have. Again, regardless of the particular substantive positions we end up taking. And so then it's no surprise if all of Western history has to be understood through a process of collective self-scrutiny, that Israel-Palestine is understood with reference to analogies, metaphors such as apartheid, colonialism, settler colonialism, and of course the coup de grâce, the pièce de résistance, Nazi. Right, if you've gotten to that point, then you're an intellectual. Why those terms? Because that is the language of the West self-scrutinizing, and we've lost any other language. Instead, it's all of us just taking positions on those already predefined discussions. Yeah, what do you think? Israel, is it kind of Nazi? Is it kind of apartheid? Right, doesn't matter what position you take, we're already having that discussion. The concepts, the terms, the very discourse has already been defined. That's power. And so if we're going to call this really the ubiquitous language of justice, but very much created and generated on the left, and again I say this was a good thing. I don't want to get rid of that. I'm not anti-woke. I'm pro-woke. But I want a very different kind of woke. That's my next book, by the way. And so, if we're nevertheless going to call this in its origins and its impetus, a kind of leftist history, what are some of the assumptions behind it? Well, I'm going to look at two. First of all, what, you might say, to your leftist friends, what entitles you to tell the rest of us that we have to be self-critical and self-scrutinizing? With what authority do you tell this to the rest of us, to your society? To which they would answer, because we also self-scrutinize. Right? And they'll give you examples. They'll say, look at the history of Marxist thought. No one's a Stalinist anymore. We've looked at our mistakes and we've considered them and discussed them. Or they'll say, look at the history of feminism. Right? It used to be, white, Western middle class. But we've broadened it, we've opened it, we've brought in minority voices and third world voices and intersectionality and so forth. I could name other examples. And here's a second attribute of this, what we could call this leftist version of history, is that it's not simply about what happens in textbooks and seminar rooms. It has to be disseminated. We need training programs. We need media events. We need television programs. Right? It has to leave the seminar room, reach the widest possible audience. This traces right back to philosophers have only ever interpreted history, however, the point is to change it. Karl Marx. Now, what happens when we put these two elements of leftist history together? Again, on the one hand, the idea, that the left has authority to teach us this because it also self-scrutinizes. What happens when we put that together with this element of mass dissemination, the imperative of mass dissemination? In fact, what we find is that the left, and I say this again with regret, I'm not anti-woke, I think this is good on the whole. Indeed, I would say some of us would have had far worse lives, and perhaps no lives, if we had not grown up in a culture which understands history this way. So again, I am not dismissing it, but my argument is that the left actually has never engaged in its own version of collective self-scrutiny. And this is the problem we face. It has done a good job of teaching the rest of us. Okay, so I'll get to mine. And it's done a good job of teaching the rest of us. A couple of decades ago, one of the founders of critical race theory, Derek Bell, published a very influential article in which he proposed a theory of what he called interest convergence, arguing persuasively that whites had only ever given blacks civil rights when it was in the whites' own interests to do so. And this had enormous consequences. It was it really founded, in many ways, critical race theory. My argument is that the same is true of the left. That these examples that I named, the so-called break with Stalinism, right, the so-called revision of feminism, a similar revision of LGBTQ+ rights, and so forth, only ever happened when it was actually in the left's self-interest. In fact, usually quite late. When they had lots of allies marching in that direction anyway, that's not self-scrutiny when it's in your interest. Nor is self-interest ever the condition posed for when we are looking at all the rest of Western history. And so to conclude, although actually I really had thought that was just going to be my introduction, but, and if you don't believe me, ask my students. To conclude, and so what we end up with is this idea that the West writ large is entrenched within, is almost chained to an ongoing history of injustice, which we have to understand this history reaching back centuries because it is still active and alive and we're still all complicit within it. But the left has made a clean break. Okay, oh no, Stalinism, well, that wasn't the real socialism, right? The Kim dynasty in North Korea, oh, but that wasn't the real socialism, right? They've made a clean break with this. How does that work? That we are bound and chained to our history, and I think rightly so, but then the people who are teaching us how to do history are not. All they have to do is say, oh, but that wasn't the real socialism. And then they can literally sidestep hundreds of millions of dead bodies or damaged lives, including Jewish ones. And I think this explains a lot about what we're seeing in those encampments. Thank you very much, and sorry I went over.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm not joking when I say, I mentioned euphoria before, and honestly, to be in a room where there is not a hostile environment, where there are scholars on the platform who are able to speak, who are able to express sophisticated and nuanced and interesting thinking and research. It is such a joy. We are incredibly ambitious in our networks in the London Centre. We're not happy that this room is not full to the brim. We need to do better. We need to be better organised. We all need to bring our people in. We need to build these spaces and to build this brilliant network and community instead of infrastructure. I'm going to come to Daniel Sugarman in a moment, but first I want to say this. I want to say that at the end of the discussion, there will be an opportunity for people to buy books, and there will be an opportunity for people to buy signed copies. And there are not only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, I don't know, people on the platform who are speaking who can sign those copies, but there are people all over this audience. There's David Seymour and Philip Spencer and Matthew Bolton and John Strawson and Yehudis Fletcher, and God forbid I've left somebody out who I haven't noticed. No? That's also part of what it means to be in a community of scholarship. I want to go finally to Daniel Sugarman. Daniel Sugarman is the, I was going to say Minister of Public Affairs, but you're not that. You're the spokesperson for something for public affairs for the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And it's very, very important to me that Daniel is here in that capacity because, well, we are not a Jewish communal organisation, we're an academic network, but we are embedded partly in the Jewish community. The Jewish community is part of the reason that we exist. We are in a proper dialogue with it. We try to inspire it. It tries to inspire us. We are very proud to have a community of hundreds of small funders who give us money every month. And I will ask Daniel Sugarman to come and speak on behalf of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. It's an honour to be here today and to have been able to listen to so many impressive academics talking about their contributions to this anthology. The response to the October the 7th mass terror attack was not a massive and sudden swing in opinion from different areas of society. It was rather an attitude and outlook which had been nourished and hot-housed within a variety of very different environments, such as academia, trade unions, and social media platforms. If the attacks of October the 7th took years to plan, the creation of major environments in the Western world in which a deeply regressive, fundamentalist terror organization could be labeled a progressive, anti-colonialist enterprise, that's taken decades to create that sort of environment. The Jewish community in this country and Jewish communal organizations which represent it, such as the Board of Deputies of British Jews, for which I work, have felt the full effect of the significant rise in anti-Semitism. It has been noted in many places, but I will note here and now again, that the spike in anti-Semitism in this country began in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas terror attack, before Israel's response. This anti-Semitism was not in response to Israel's actions, it was celebratory in nature. Along with the mass terror attack itself, it is that response which is something that Jews and their allies around the world will not quickly forget. The sharp rise in disinformation, I should say, aided by the creation of the internet and social media platforms, has undoubtedly exacerbated this shift. Every single day it is possible to go online on TikTok or Instagram, Twitter or YouTube, and see people confidently expressing beliefs and ideas about Jews, Israel and Zionism that do not have the slightest connection to reality. People with Palestinian flags or watermelon emojis in their usernames will cheerfully share Nazi-grade anti-Semitism. People who describe themselves as anti-racists will scream at Jews on university campuses, as we've heard, to go back to Poland. Those who observe and monitor anti-Semitism on social media will be acutely aware of the strong connections now being developed between Islamists and elements of the far right. On Elon Musk's X, where the worst forms of hatred are given free rein, a rogues gallery of neo-Nazis have developed a sudden devotion to the Palestinian cause as a way to funnel anti-Israel users into what we might call full-fat anti-Semitism. And the terrifying thing is that such hate influencers have seen their follower count and reach soar as a result. Here in the UK, a podcast linked to an infamous Islamist news site has in the past few months hosted a rogues gallery of British neo-Nazis and far-right leaders to spew their hatred and loathing for Zionism. A few weeks ago, I wrote for a newspaper about a phenomenon we can perhaps call the October the 7th test. It is a simple one. It looks at all of the people who are now the most vocal about the terrible situation in Gaza, and it is a terrible situation, and asks what their response was to the October the 7th attacks. Were they celebrating? Were they justifying? Were they denying? And the number of people who fail this basic test is staggering. But amidst the gloom, there is hope. The publication of this anthology, with its incisive clarity about the issues we are facing, is a cause for hope. The existence of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism is likewise a cause for hope. Thank you to David Hirsh, to Rosa Freedman, to Adelia Lanez-Zafir for editing this anthology. And thank you to all of those who contributed to this anthology. And thank you finally to each and every one of you who have come here today for this book launch. May we all see happier and more peaceful times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I want to give an opportunity for people to have a say, for people to ask questions. I don't think we're going to go on for very long because we're keen to get some of your money and to get you some books. And we're not going to go on for hours, but people are very welcome to have, 1 minute to ask a question, to make a point, and then we will go very quickly through the panel again and conclude. Yes, sir. Over there. You can go next. Okay, go on.
My name's Daniel Ben-Ami. I'm profoundly anti-woke, if you want to use that terminology. And one reason for that is because I think if you want to understand the really visceral anti-Semitism in the West after the 7th of October, it's precisely because woke ideas have become prevalent. If you believe Jews enjoy white privilege, which is a woke idea, that strengthens anti-Semitism. If you believe there's a hierarchy of oppression and Jews are at the top, another woke idea, then that strengthens anti-Semitism. If you believe that modernity and progress are bad, ideas which are often associated with Jews, again woke ideas, that strengthens anti-Semitism. I know there are people who believe that you can tweak woke ideas and make them more Jew-friendly. I don't believe that at all. I really think if you want to understand why there's such a vicious, horrible, visceral anti-Semitic reaction to the 7th of October, it's not mainly to do with the far right, although that is a problem. It's not mainly to do with Islamism, although that's a problem. It really is the prevalence of woke ideas, which I think is a very serious problem.
Thanks very much. The guy behind you, 2 rows back, please.
Yes, just a brief comment and a question. The brief comment was to your initial introduction when you said something like, we are an academia and we're not going anywhere, which I find an absolutely disgraceful, basically catastrophic indictment of academia, that something like that has to be actually uttered in today's world. The question I have is for Torkel from Oslo, about the Oslo Accords. Given Norwegian anti-Semitism, did Norway sponsor the Oslo Accords and initiate them in spite of Norwegian anti-Semitism or because of Norwegian anti-Semitism?
Up here, please.
Thank you. First of all, full disclosure, I'm not an academic. Anna, when you were speaking, I was reminded and struck by the expression, anti-Semitism is a very light sleeper. And this is an expression that was coined by Conor Cruise O'Brien, the Anglo-Irish historian. And it was picked up in a study that was made by the Runnymede Trust in the 1990s. I actually looked this up on my phone, the beauty of the phones. And what's interesting, without going into what's behind the Runnymede Trust and who was, although Trevor Phillips was the president of the Runnymede Trust at the time that paper was written, to give you some idea. There is a section right at the back that talks about anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. It exclusively focuses on the far right as being the problem. And so my question to you is actually, were the sleepers those who were ignoring the impact and the rise of anti-Semitism on the left? And is that one of the things that actually we have reaped today in terms of responses to October the 7th? Thank
you. This room is full of extremely accomplished and brilliant women. I would really like them to feel that they can participate. While people are thinking about that, I will go to Adam.
Hiya, thank you very much, all of you, for tonight. I was just wondering, obviously coming from a slightly younger demographic, I kind of see, especially on social media, the echo chamber it creates in terms of spreading information about what is going on in Israel. And I think so many young people who maybe don't understand what's going on, because that's not my place to say whether they do or don't, but people are fed this information who maybe don't have as much experience in knowledge around the history of what's going on in Israel, etc. And they basically become, in a way, radicalized and get this very polarized view of what happens. And I find it difficult talking to my peers who aren't Jewish, because they basically have just been fed one stream of information that they see online, and it then makes it impossible to have kind of like civil discourse with them. So I was wondering if any of you had any proposals for how you could kind of open up ways of having conversations with people like that.
Okay, hello. Speaking as one of the not brilliant women here. So there's been a big marriage between the left and the right in anti-Semitism. Is it going to pop? Is it going to be an explosion? At what point will there be too much of a conflict between Islam and the woke?
Anybody else? I'm going to go, well, I'll take one more quickly, and then I'm going to go back to the panel, and then we're going to get some books signed, and then we're going to get a drink.
I thought tonight was very good, and it's excellent discourse around anti-Semitism. I was very involved in the Labour Party in the 1980s, and what I will say, there was a lot of discourse about left anti-Semitism. Aubrey Rose, for example, wrote a fantastic paper, and there was a book, The Left Against Zion, by Robert Wistrich. My question, there is this academic litmus test at the moment. You have to stand for or against Palestine. But if you're an activist in other areas, you're also facing this litmus test. Where do you stand on Israel? Do you support Netanyahu? And do you believe that anti-Semitism is being weaponized to stop an open debate? And I think these are very dangerous times in terms of Jews being involved in society and being allowed to partake in the wider society without having this litmus test.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go through the panel quickly. Eric, I've now realised that clock has stopped up there, so I'm on you. Starting with Rosa.
Thank you. So just on the point about wokeness, wokeness or the left is not a problem. Non-discrimination against people based on their fundamental and protected characteristics is not a problem. The problem becomes anti-Semitism, whether it's on the left, the radical left, whether it's on the far right, or whether it's in radical Islam. It's not just a tolerance of anti-Semitism, it's a proposing of anti-Semitism that's the problem. And if I had to ally with any type of anti-Semitism, which I don't want to, I would prefer not to be with the white supremacist, fascist Nazis, and I'd rather not be with the radical Islamists who hate women and hate gays and pretty much hate everyone that's not a radical Islamist. The left has a massive problem. But the problem is not, oh, let's just go back to what Eric was saying, previous history of colonialism and discrimination. So I want to start with that point. The point on universities and discourse. I teach lots of young people, and I don't envy you at all. TikTok is not anyone's friend, apart from my mother who watches it to learn how to fold clothes. I'm not joking. The sound bites of how to sort of ruin any discourse and discussion happens on TikTok. We did something interesting at our university based on the sex and gender wars. Lessons have been learned. After 7th of October, our Vice-Chancellor called a meeting, an open meeting for staff and students affected by October the 7th to have a facilitated discussion. The encampments that we've got in our university are open to people going over and having a discussion. The purpose of academia is knowledge production. To do that, we have to have discussions. We need to look to the tops of our universities, to our vice-chancellors, to our academics, to be facilitating those discussions and also leading by example. And students need to be demanding of their universities that the leadership, who get paid a lot of money, are making that kind of space. But yeah, it is difficult. One of the people who's really worth following is an Iranian woman who talks about the link between radical Islam and the post-Soviet left and how they came together to try and advance one another's aims, essentially. The post-Soviet left just hated the West, and the radical Islamists, well, hated the Jews and the women and the gays. But they sort of had this marriage of convenience. I can't for the life of me remember her name, but I'll Google it and tell you after. But sometimes promoting voices on these social media platforms starts conversations that you cannot start because you're already perceived as being biased.
Thanks, Rosa. Torkel.
Wonderful questions, and I wish we had more time, David, but I'll start by answering the Oslo Accords question, because that's something I devote a chapter to in my book. And now the Oslo Accords, the question was whether the Oslo Accords, the peace talks in Oslo, were they initiated by Norwegians because of anti-Semitism or in spite of? Let me try to explain why it's slightly the wrong question. The motivation for starting the back channel in Oslo, I mean, partly it was coincidences that made a certain group of academics in Oslo that had some contacts and they started these talks. But there was a larger backdrop to this where you have a political class that really wanted to build Norway as what they called a humanitarian great power. Small state, but very big ambitions to be something, to mean something on the international stage. So you could say there's a serious aspect of vanity there. So that's the background. But so all this starts in '93, or it becomes public in '93. It starts a little bit before. And if you look at the publications of all the different trade unions in the 90s, starting in '93 particularly, you see that there's hardly any rabid anti-Israelism. what happens is, of course, as you all know, that the peace process breaks down in 2000 at Camp David, when Arafat says no thank you to a Palestinian state. You all know that. After that point, if you look at all these publications, and there is an unpublished MA thesis about this, that says that from that moment, the anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism, is everywhere in all these publications. So I find it fascinating because it means, to me at least, I think the best analysis is that the Oslo Accords is a pause. It's a pause in anti-Zionism in Norway because the peace process is owned by the Labour Party and the trade unions. That's the way to understand the process. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Torkel. Eric, I'm going to come to Eric and then I'm going to ask Anna to have the last word.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, well, let me tell you a queer story. The word queer was absolutely and unequivocally an insult, and a horridly degrading insult for a very, very long time. And therefore, gays could have just rejected it, LGBTQ people could have just rejected it and said, no, that's only evil for us. Instead, they infiltrated it. They took it over. As anyone who studies biblical interpretation will know, ideas are never fixed in their meanings, and certainly not ideas about society and culture and history. Ideas have a life, and we can be active participants, right? We don't have to be passive victims of ideas. And I stand by the idea that, again, I think a few of us here today would have had far worse lives and perhaps no lives at all had we not grown up in a culture in which collective self-criticism had not become the norm. And therefore, my idea for infiltrating woke, right, reappropriating it, is simply to tell people who do critical theory, who do leftist politics, you've taught us a lot. That's good. Now do it yourself. And I think that can happen. Let me tell you something else I don't like about woke, just so you know that there's some... Right? All right, anybody who knows me knows that I am a passionate, zealous, and uncompromising free speech advocate. I don't believe in the kind of censorship that goes on either legally or even informally, mostly informally, and particularly in academic institutions. And this gets us to our question of academic freedom. The problem with these encampments, which I absolutely defend as a matter of free speech, the problem with them is not that they should not have the freedom, is that they have virtually no intellectual content. The problem is not with the freedom that they should or should not have, but with the fact that they're choosing universities to do something which has no intellectual content or very little. Why? Because universities are about debating, dissecting, arguing, and discussing, and not about rallies and jamborees. If you want rallies and jamborees, join the Girl Guides.
Thanks, Eric. So obviously I can't resist interjecting my own point on the discussion of woke, and the aspect of the term woke that bothers me in particular is the aspect that is also present in the term, if some of you will remember it, of politically correct, and none of you will be old enough to remember the term true class consciousness, because those terms posit the idea that there is a truth. And all you need to do is to come to true consciousness, and then your ideas are in tune with the whole of the working class, which will become the whole of humanity, and you will be on the side of the good. But if you do not have true consciousness, then you have false consciousness, and you are wrong. And that way, it is possible for the Gulag to lie. And the problem with the term woke is that it also posits a set of ideas that are true, but that are denied to the overwhelming majority of people who are not woke, who are sleeping. And so it kind of, the term itself feeds into a conspiracy fantasy of the woke who understand the truth and the sheeple who are the sheep who are fast asleep. So that's the aspect that really bothers me. We could have much more of this debate. Anna Zawadzka.
Thank you so much for this question about underestimating or omitting the left, the anti-Semitism on the left in 90s. I think it's very complicated, and we don't have time to elaborate on it, but I would mention, first of all, that in 90s were a very specific time in Eastern Europe, because actually the state ideology and credibility was entirely built on anti-communism. So almost no one identified as leftist in 90s because it was kind of a political suicide to identify as that. If there were some people who flirt with the leftism, it was this old school leftism, meaning the unions, workers' rights, wages, and so on. Now we miss actually this kind of left perspective in Poland. Now the proportions are completely different. And the other thing is that the definition of anti-Semitism and racism in Poland as a problem of a far right in the 90s was of course a way to actually avoid the topic, to say that's just an extremism, it has nothing to do with normal people, with the mainstream, with us. That's them, that's the wild ones, you know, that's the football fans. And I think this kind of a perspective and what the damage it made is still very present in Polish society. Recently, I was invited by a Rotary Club for a small lecture about the anti-Semitism in a football club culture. And it was in Krakow, which is especially known because of that. Like, if you travel through Krakow, you see Star of Davids everywhere, and it's definitely not the sign of a friendship to Jews. So, and I was trying, and I showed them a lot of pictures, and they said at the end of it, and they are not right-wing or left-wing extremists at all. They are these regular moderate Poles. They were trying to explain to me that it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, because I simply don't understand that in Krakow it is how it is. The Star of David is a sign of an enemy, but they don't even know that it's a sign of Jews. And that's the way of thinking, you know, like, let's not connect some facts, because then you need to deal with anti-Semitism. And so I think there are like a lot of factors here, and maybe the last factor I should mention is that the current leftist movement, the young leftists, let's say, they are very much trapped in between local contexts of leftism and the delegitimization of the leftism in Poland in general, and in between the patterns of the leftist discourses and behaviors on the West, because the West still has a very high status in Poland. So usually they repeat what the Western discourse says in order to legitimize themselves, but they with no regard to the local context, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, everybody. And there are books on sale upstairs at the back, I believe.